The tablecloth was white linen, the kind my late wife Margaret used to iron with steam and a careful hand every Sunday morning. I noticed it the moment I walked into the private dining room of the restaurant, a detail so ordinary, so close to something I loved, that it softened me right away. I should have known better than to let it. My son Thomas had reserved the entire back room of Harrington's Grill for what he called a family milestone dinner. He had just been named Executive Vice President of Caldwell Regional Construction, the promotion he had been chasing for 3 years. I was proud of him. Genuinely, deeply proud. I drove 40 minutes from my house in Millbrook, wore the only blazer I still owned, and brought a card with a check inside because I didn't know what else to give a man who already had everything. What I didn't know, walking into that room, was that the evening had already been decided before I arrived. Not the menu, not the speeches. The evening itself, what it would mean, what it would cost me, what it would quietly reveal about the people sitting around that table. I was the last one there. Thomas stood near the head of the table in a charcoal suit, his hair trimmed sharp, every inch the VP he had just become. Beside him was his wife, my daughter-in-law Renata. She was in a burgundy dress with her hair pulled back, holding a glass of sparkling water and talking to her sister. When she saw me come in, she smiled the way you smile at a neighbor you don't particularly like but have to be polite to anyway. "Dad, you made it," Thomas said. He hugged me, and it was a real hug, the kind I recognized from when he was younger, before Renata and the house in Westfield and the BMW in the driveway. I held on to it for a second. There were 12 people in the room. Thomas's in-laws, a few of his work colleagues, Renata's 2 sisters, and my grandson Elliot, Thomas's son from his first marriage, 19 years old, home from his first year of college. Elliot was the one who had called me the week before to remind me about the dinner. He was the one who had texted me the address twice, just to make sure. I was seated at the far end of the table, not across from Thomas, not beside Elliot. At the end, between one of Renata's sisters and a colleague of Thomas's whom I had never met and who spent most of the evening looking at his phone, I didn't say anything about the seating. I unfolded my napkin, set it on my lap, and ordered the chicken because it was the least expensive thing on the menu. Old habit. One I had kept up for reasons nobody at that table understood. The evening started well enough. Thomas gave a short speech about hard work and opportunity. His father-in-law, a man named Gerald who owned a chain of dry cleaning stores, raised a glass and said Thomas had become the man he always believed he could be. Renata beamed. Elliot caught my eye across the table and raised his water glass slightly in my direction. I smiled back. Then the appetizers came, and the table broke into smaller conversations, and I found myself mostly quiet, listening. It was during the main course that I first felt it. The shift. The way a room changes temperature without anyone opening a window. Gerald made a comment about Thomas's trajectory and how the sky was the limit now that he was in a VP role. Thomas laughed and said he had big plans. Renata reached over and touched his arm and said, "We have big plans." One of her sisters asked about a lake house they had been looking at in Vermont. Thomas said they were close to putting in an offer. "Where does that leave the Millbrook house?" Gerald asked, meaning my house. The house I had lived in for 31 years, where Thomas grew up, where Margaret died in the bedroom with the yellow curtains. The table went a little quiet. Not everyone, just the people who already knew what was being discussed. "We've been talking to Dad about options," Thomas said carefully, glancing toward my end of the table. He said it with the tone of a man who has been rehearsing the sentence. "What kind of options?" I asked. Renata set down her fork. "There's a very lovely senior living community about 20 minutes from us in Westfield," she said. "It's not a nursing home. It's independent living. Beautiful grounds, activities, medical staff on site. A lot of people your age actually prefer it to the isolation of a big house." I looked at her. "I'm 63, I said. "Right. But the waiting lists are long," she said pleasantly. "You'd want to get on one now." Gerald nodded as if this was the most reasonable thing he had ever heard. Thomas was looking at his plate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say anything sharp. I asked what these places typically cost, and Renata said the one she had in mind was around $5,000 a month for a one-bedroom unit. Gerald mentioned that the Millbrook house, if I decided to sell, would more than cover it for years. He said it with the confidence of a man who has already run the numbers. And that was when Thomas looked up at me, and I saw it. Not cruelty. I want to be fair to my son, because he is not a cruel man. What I saw was something quieter, and in some ways worse. Resignation. He had already decided. He had let Renata and Gerald do the talking because he didn't want to be the one to say it to my face, but the decision had been made somewhere before this dinner, in a kitchen in Westfield, without me in the room. I picked up my fork and finished my chicken. I thanked the server when she refilled my water. I listened to the rest of the conversation. Move on to other things. The Vermont Lake House. A trip to Portugal. Thomas and Renata were planning. A school fundraiser one of Renata's sisters was chairing. At the end of the night, I shook Gerald's hand, kissed Renata on the cheek, hugged Thomas again, a shorter hug this time, and found Elliot waiting by the coat check. "You okay, Grandpa?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine," I said. "Walk me to my car?" We walked out into the October night. Leaves on the sidewalk, the air cold and clear. Elliot had his hands in his jacket pockets and was quiet for a moment before he said, "I didn't know they were going to bring that up tonight." "Did you know they were going to bring it up at all?" He hesitated. "Mom mentioned it once. I told her it wasn't my business." I nodded. I put my hand on his shoulder for a second. "You're a good kid," I said. I drove home to Millbrook in the dark. I want to explain something, because I think it matters, and because the people at that dinner deserve to know it and didn't. When my wife Margaret died 4 years ago, I stepped back. From everything. From the company I had spent 28 years building from a 2-truck operation out of a rented garage into one of the largest regional construction firms in the state. I stepped back because the grief was total, and because I had promised myself, after watching Margaret spend her last year too tired to enjoy anything, that I was not going to spend whatever time I had left inside an office. I handed operational control to a board I trusted. I kept my shares 51% of Caldwell Regional Construction, quietly held, never advertised. I moved back to the house in Millbrook, let my hair go gray, started growing tomatoes in the backyard, and became, to most people who saw me at the grocery store or the hardware shop, a retired man of no particular significance, including, it turned out, to my own son. Thomas had been hired at Caldwell 3 years before I stepped back. I had made sure, through a third party, that his application got a fair look, nothing more than that. He got the job on his own merits. He rose on his own merits. I watched from a careful distance as he became good at his work, and I was proud of that. I never told him I still owned the company he worked for because I wanted him to believe in himself the way I believed in him. I wanted his success to belong entirely to him. I see now that this was a mistake, not because he didn't deserve the success, but because the silence left too much room for other people to fill with the wrong story about who I was. The week after the dinner, I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Holloway whom I had worked with for 20 years. I told her what had happened. I told her I wanted to understand my options, not for revenge. I want to be careful about that word, but because I had been sitting in my kitchen for 3 days, thinking about a $5,000 a month 1-bedroom unit in Westfield, and something in me had gone very still and very clear. Patricia listened. Then she said, "You know the board has been trying to reach you for 2 months about the VP compensation package for Thomas's new role." I said I knew. She said, "You have to sign off on it. As majority shareholder, any executive compensation above a certain threshold requires your approval." I said I knew that too. "Do you want to sign off on it?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the dead tomato plants from the summer, at the old oak tree Margaret had always said she loved. "Schedule a board meeting," I said. "I'll come in. I want to be honest about what happened next, because honesty is the only thing I have left that nobody can take from me. I did not set out to humiliate my son the way he had allowed me to be humiliated at that dinner. I am not that kind of man. What I set out to do was simpler and harder at the same time. I set out to be seen, to stop pretending, for everyone's sake, that the retired man with the old blazer and the modest house in Millbrook was the whole story. The board meeting was on a Thursday morning in November. Caldwell Regional Construction's offices were on the fourth floor of a glass building off Route 9, conference room with a view of the river. I had not been inside that building in 3 years. Patricia came with me. I wore a suit, not the blazer from the dinner, a better one, navy, that Margaret had picked out for me years ago and that still fit. The board knew I was coming. They did not know, and this is the part I have thought about carefully since that Thomas would be in the building that morning. There was no reason for him to be there. He had no meeting scheduled, no obligation to be on the fourth floor. But it is a truth about life that the moments you have not planned for have a way of arriving exactly when they need to. I was walking from the elevator toward the conference room when I heard his voice down the corridor. He was talking to the HR director outside her office. Something about the paperwork for his new title and the changes to his benefits package. He had his back to me. Patricia touched my arm lightly. I kept walking. I don't know at what point Thomas registered that the man walking past him in the navy suit was his father. I didn't stop to watch. I heard him go quiet mid-sentence. I heard Patricia say a brief good morning to the HR director, and then the conference room door was open and I was inside and there were 7 people standing up to shake my hand. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. We went through the standard business quarterly financials, 2 major project bids pending approval, the compensation package. I asked questions. I had done my reading. Patricia sat beside me and took notes. The board members, most of whom I had known for years, treated me the way they always had, with the particular respect that comes from understanding exactly how much someone has built and what it cost them to build it. When the meeting was over and we were gathering papers, the board chair, a man named Douglas, who had been with the company for 15 years, leaned over and said quietly, "It's good to have you back in the room, Robert." I told him I wouldn't be making it a habit, but that some things required a personal appearance. Thomas was waiting in the hallway. He was standing outside the conference room door when I came out, his jacket still on, his face doing something complicated that I recognized as the particular expression of a man who has just understood something about his life that he cannot ununderstand. Patricia excused herself to speak with the board chair, and then it was just the 2 of us in that corridor. "Dad," he said. "Thomas, you own this company, 51% of it," I said. "Have for 28 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Down the hall, I could hear phones ringing. The ordinary sounds of a Thursday morning at an office building. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally said. This is the part I had thought about the most. I had rehearsed a dozen answers in the kitchen at Millbrook over the previous 3 weeks, and none of them felt right until I was standing there, looking at my son's face, and I understood that the rehearsed ones were all wrong, because I wanted you to know you did this yourself, I said. Because I wanted you to believe that. And because I stopped for a second. Because your mother and I agreed, when you were young, that we would never let money be the reason people were close to us. We wanted to know who people actually were. He looked at the floor. "The dinner," he said. "Yes, Renata organized that. The conversation about Millbrook. That was, Thomas." I waited until he looked at me. "I'm not angry at Renata. I'm not angry at you. But I need you to understand something. That house is not an asset to be liquidated. That house is where your mother spent 31 years, where you grew up. And I am 63 years old, not 83. And nobody is going to make that decision for me at a dinner I was invited to celebrate your success." He nodded slowly. His jaw was tight. "I'm going to continue to live in Millbrook," I said. "I'm going to continue to grow my tomatoes and drive my truck and be, to anyone who hasn't done their homework, a retired man of no particular interest. And I am going to continue to hold my shares in this company and attend board meetings when they require my presence. That is not going to change." "What about the compensation package?" he asked. His voice was steady, but I could hear what the question actually cost him. "It's approved," I said. "You earned that VP title. Thomas, I've been watching from further away than you knew, and I mean it when I say I'm proud of what you've built here. That's real. That has nothing to do with the rest of this." He let out a breath. It was a long one, the kind that carries a lot of weight. We stood there in that corridor for another moment, neither of us quite sure what the next sentence was supposed to be. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from understanding that a relationship you thought you knew has edges you never mapped. Thomas and I were both standing at one of those edges, and neither of us was entirely ready to step forward. "I'll talk to Renata," he said finally. "That's between you and her," I said. "That's your house." I buttoned my jacket, picked up the folder Patricia had left with me, and walked toward the elevator. I did not look back. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because I had run out of things to say, and I have never been a man who fills silence with words just to avoid the feeling of it. The drive back to Millbrook took 40 minutes. I stopped at the hardware store on the way home because I needed a new pair of work gloves. The old ones had worn through at the thumb, and I had been putting off replacing them for 2 months. I bought the gloves and a bag of birdseed and drove the rest of the way home with the radio on low. I didn't hear from Thomas for 11 days. I am not going to pretend that those 11 days were easy. I am 63 years old, and I have buried a wife and built a company and raised a son who turned into a person I mostly respect, and I know by now that the things worth having are not the ones that come without cost. But sitting in that house in the evenings, with the rooms quiet and the light fading early the way it does in November, I felt the weight of all the years of keeping quiet and the particular loneliness of being known incompletely by the people who are supposed to know you best. Elliot called on the 3rd day. He asked if he could come by on Saturday. I said yes. He showed up with a bag of groceries and made us both breakfast eggs, toast, the good coffee he knows I like, and we sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about his classes and a girl he had met in his economics course and the novel he had been reading and whether the oak tree in the backyard needed trimming before the winter. He did not ask about the board meeting. He did not ask about his father. He just showed up and made breakfast and talked to me like a person, and I will carry that with me for a long time. On the 11th day, Thomas called. He asked if he could come to Millbrook. Not with Renata alone. I said yes. He came on a Sunday afternoon, parked his BMW in the driveway, and stood at the back door with a slight uncertainty that reminded me, in a way that caught me off guard, of the way he used to stand at the door of my study when he was 12 and had something to tell me he wasn't sure how to say. We sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten 10,000 meals and where Margaret used to grade her students' papers on Friday evenings. And Thomas talked for a long time. He talked about the year after Margaret died, and how he had watched me go quiet and small, and how he had misread that as deterioration. He talked about Renata and how she was not a bad person, and I believe him. I do not think she is a bad person. I think she is a person who looks at the world in terms of costs and resources and made an assessment that was cold and wrong. He talked about the pressure of the VP role and the lake house and the Portugal trip, and the way he had let himself get so deep inside the life he was building that he had stopped seeing me clearly. I listened to all of it. I did not offer him easy comfort, because he didn't need comfort. He needed honesty. And the honest thing I could say was that I understood and that I was not interested in holding it over him. "I should have told you," I said, "about the company. A long time ago, I made choices about how to handle that, and some of them were wrong. You were protecting me." I was. And I was protecting myself. Probably. It's not always easy to separate those things. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "The house. Millbrook. I want you to know that was never I. Don't want you to sell it. I don't care about the money." "I know," I said. And I did know. Thomas is not Gerald. He was standing in a current that was pulling him somewhere, and he hadn't braced himself against it the way he should have. That is different from being the current. We talked for 3 hours. At some point I made coffee. At some point the conversation moved away from what had happened and into other things. A project he was managing in the spring. A trail near Millbrook he had run on years ago and wanted to come back to. By the time he left, it was dark outside and cold. He hugged me at the door. A real hug. The same one I recognized from before all of this. I watched his car back out of the driveway, and then I stood in the kitchen for a while, in the quiet, not unhappy. There are things I still think about when the house is still and the November dark comes in early through the windows. I think about Margaret and what she would have made of all of this, and I am fairly sure she would have told me I should have handled it differently from the beginning. Been more open, let people in, stopped performing the modesty that was half genuine and half a habit I had mistaken for a virtue. She was right about most things, and she would have been right about that. I think about the word revenge, which is not a word I want attached to what happened. I did not walk into that board meeting to punish Thomas. I walked in because I had spent 4 years making myself invisible, and a dinner in October made me understand that I had made myself too invisible, in ways that had costs I hadn't fully accounted for. What I wanted was not to take something away from my son. What I wanted was to be known accurately, by people I loved, before it was too late for that to matter. I think about Renata, who has not called but who, according to Elliot, has been quieter at home since November. I don't wish her harm. I hope she finds her way to understanding that the people who love Thomas have more dimensions than she has been willing to assign us. I think about Elliot most of all. 19 years old, first year of college. The one who called to remind me about a dinner he didn't fully trust. The one who walked me to my car and asked if I was okay. He came back the following Saturday with groceries again. And the Saturday after that, and we have established between us, without making it official or sentimental, a weekly breakfast that I look forward to all week. He asked me once, over eggs, what it was like to build something as big as what I had built and then just step back from it. I thought about it for a while before I answered. I told him it was like putting down something very heavy that you had been carrying for so long you had forgotten you were carrying it. I told him the putting down was not loss, even though it felt like it at first. I told him that what I had now, the house, the backyard, the mornings, the quiet, was not nothing. It was, in fact, what everything I had built had been for. He nodded like he was filing it away somewhere careful. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Some of it," I said. "The building, the problem-solving, the moment when a project that was a drawing on paper becomes a thing that stands in the world and will stand there after you're gone. But not the rest of it?" "Not the rest of it," I said. He poured himself more coffee and we sat with that for a while, which is one of the things I have always liked about Elliot. He is not afraid of the space between sentences. Last week, I signed off on the final approval for Thomas's compensation package. Patricia handled the paperwork. In the notes section, where shareholders sometimes leave comments, I wrote one sentence. Well earned. Thomas called the next day to say thank you. The call lasted 6 minutes, which is about right for two men who are still finding their way back toward each other and understand that it's going to take longer than a phone call to get all the way there. We made plans to have lunch in December. I said I would drive up to Westfield. He said he knew a good place. I told him to pick somewhere the chicken wasn't too expensive. He laughed an actual laugh, surprised and real, and said he would find somewhere better than that. The oak tree in the backyard is bare now. I had it trimmed last weekend, the way Elliot suggested, and the yard looks wider without the low branches crowding the fence line. I put up a new bird feeder near the kitchen window, the good kind, metal, squirrel-resistant. In the mornings I drink my coffee and watch whoever shows up. Margaret always said the oak tree was the best thing about the house. She was right. She was right about most things. I think she would be satisfied with how this ended, more or less. She would tell me there is more work to do, that relationships are long and require tending, and that a Sunday afternoon in November is not a resolution. It's a beginning. She would be right about that, too. I am not a man given to grand conclusions. I spent most of my life doing the work in front of me, and trusting that the larger shape of things would reveal itself over time. I still believe that. I still believe that what you build, and how you build it, and who you are when nobody is watching, those are the things that last. I am 63 years old. I have a son I am finding my way back to, a grandson who shows up on Saturdays with groceries, a house on a quiet street in Millbrook, and 51% of a construction company that is going to have a very strong spring. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything.